All right, welcome everybody to another art brunch where we explore the wisdom of the arts, spirituality, and the great ideas. We continue our series, America Collects. Now, we have so far looked at the great collections bequeathed to some of our best museums and galleries. The patrons of those contributions have been J.P. Morgan, Henri and Helen Frick, and Alfred C. Barnes. As you know, the latter using his art specifically to expand the perceptive abilities of his workers and the public in general. Well, this week we look at an equally, if not more exceptional patron of the arts, who also herself was an artist. She did something the other collectors we've discussed did not do. Instead of primarily choosing European art, she focused on the art being produced in her own country. Gertrude Vanderbilt, like heiress Peggy Guggenheim, who I will discuss next week, found her name more of a burden than a blessing. By the age of 11, she discovered that the name Vanderbilt created as many restrictions on her life and who she could become as it presented opportunities. Gertrude was expected to follow the conventional path of a Vanderbilt woman and marry into another prominent family, be a socialite, host lavish parties, and support worthy social causes. But this script did not provide the meaning and purpose that Gertrude longed for. Now, it might be difficult to feel much sympathy for a young lady who spent her summers here at the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. But wealth and a famous name, especially among women during the Gilded Age, can threaten one of our most prized inalienable rights, and that is personal freedom. Gertrude did follow some of the script. At the age of 21, she married world-class polo player Henri Whitney. Henri Whitney came with his own great fortune from oil and tobacco businesses. For the most part, they had a satisfying relationship. You see here. There he is. Sorry. That's her husband, Henri Whitney. This portrait of her by Howard Cushing was made when Gertrude was around the age of 27. She is portrayed as a traditional young heiress with a beautiful gown, typical of a high society young woman. But that will change over the next several years. Hold on, my slides are completely out of order here. Hold on, that's the one I'm looking for. A gown typical of an heiress. But soon, she will look like this. She has radically changed how she wished to be portrayed. She now champions all that is modern. Now, how did this happen? Well, let me go backwards. In the early 1900s, she toured Europe, exploring all the amazing museums and galleries. And the art bug completely infected her. And she particularly was mesmerized by the burgeoning modern art created in the studios of Montmartre and Montparnasse in France. And what she saw there encouraged her to pursue her own creativity. So she began studying, of all things for a woman of her day, sculpting. One of her instructors, at least for a brief period, was none other than Auguste Rodin. Now, she was a fast learner, getting her first commission in 1901 for a work titled Aspiration, a life-size male nude in plaster, which appeared outside the New York State Building at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. Now, by the way, a woman sculpting a completely nude man was also scandalous of the day. The fact that it was from a well-known heiress made it even more scandalous. Now, this is the best photo I could find of it. The reason is because it was not seen or heard of again after the exposition. Now, my guess is her husband or members of the Vanderbilt family arranged for its disappearance. Art was fine for a Vanderbilt woman if it remained only a hobby. But as a career, it was a stain on the Vanderbilt and Whitney name. High society women just didn't do that sort of thing. Here's the photo you see. Now she's changing her tune after that trip to Europe. Here's what she also did. She played a significant role in producing the famous Armory show in New York City in 1913, which introduced the European avant-garde to the United States. But it was creating art that finally provided Gertrude with a mission. And she went all in. Now, Gertrude immediately faced criticism, not only from her family, but from the art world she has entered. Curators and critics didn't take a wealthy heiress seriously at first. And when Gertrude funded most of her early commissions, she was accused of driving down the price other artists could charge. When she then sold her services at market value, she was accused of taking commissions away from artists who needed the money more than she did. It was the classic situation of damned if you do, damned if you don't. So Gertrude, in the early years, presented her work under various aliases. Gertrude didn't get discouraged, though. In fact, such obstacles helped her develop a deep empathy for the plight of other artists. Gertrude opened a studio for herself and other artists in Greenwich Village. And I got to know many talented artists who were struggling to survive living in that neighborhood. In 1907, she converted her own studio into an exhibition space for artists. And in 1914, she purchased the adjoining property, which you can see here, a much larger property, to create more gallery space for artists and opened it to the public as the Whitney Studio. Here, artists could engage fellow artists and the public with untested ideas. The very next year, she established a charitable organization, the Friends of Young Artists. And 3 years after that, she established the Whitney Studio Club, where young local artists could meet and exchange ideas, study, show their work, which was even more important. The Studio Club was furnished with a reference library, a billiard table, and a sketching studio. So she now has a noble cause to support and champion talented American artists, including herself. Now, what you're seeing here is the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture, Gertrude's former studio and artist club. At this site, Gertrude held numerous exhibits for American artists who were as yet unknown. That's the key point. She championed artists who were completely unknown. But partly through her own efforts, they became well-known. In fact, they became some of the best-known artists of their generation. And she would, over the years, acquire a collection of some 600 works of modern American art, which was overlooked by the critics who favored the old masters or the art of Europe. Now, this portrait of Gertrude was painted by one of those young, talented artists she championed to her wealthy friends, Robert Henri. He would become one of the most important leaders of what is known as the Ashcan School of American Art. I'll explain that, what it is, in a little bit, but I want to focus on the subject first. This portrait reveals so much about who Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was. Notice that Gertrude is wearing pants. Actually, they're pajama pants. Her husband would not allow the painting in their home for that reason. He said, "No one will see my wife in pants." In those days, Vanderbilt women and Whitney women did not wear pants. Well, Gertrude did. But the choice to wear pants also hints at another aspect of Gertrude's identity. You see, when Gertrude was in her teens, she developed a romantic crush on a female friend. Now, any relationship that may have developed would have been scandalous to the Vanderbilts, so her parents forced an end to the friendship. Now, Gertrude would often mention to friends that she longed to be a boy and that her female body felt like a burden. Now, our society today has come a long way, but in those days and in that high society, bisexuality or trans identity was strictly taboo. Now, to her parents' delight, Gertrude did continue to wear fancy dresses before the public and did go on to have several boyfriends before her marriage to Henri Whitney. However, as this portrait makes clear, she is an independent woman, at least now in her mid-20s. And she will create something more with her life than simply host lavish parties. She will become a serious artist and a serious patron of talented American artists. Now let's return to her support of the Armory show. Gertrude viewed this exhibit not as a way of finding European art to collect, but as a way to inspire local artists who wanted to create cutting-edge art. Gertrude wanted to find these native diamonds in the rough and help these young artists develop into great artists like she had encountered in Europe. Gertrude not only used her wealth to support art in the United States, she dedicated a great deal of her time and money to various relief efforts, establishing and maintaining a fully operational hospital for wounded soldiers just north of Paris, France. But while at the hospital, Gertrude Whitney made drawings of the soldiers, which became plans for her memorials in New York City. So before we look at the work of artists she supported, let's continue to take a look at her own artistic legacy. This is her, by the way, in front of her war memorial that she created. The Washington Heights War Memorial. It was created in 1921. The monument commemorates soldiers from the existing branches of the military, the Navy, the Army, and the Marine Corps. In 1924, she was commissioned by the city of Cody, Wyoming, to commemorate the town's most famous citizen, Buffalo Bill. Now, Vanderbilt funded most of the estimated $50,000 cost for the memorial. European countries also sought her services. This monument depicting Christopher Columbus resides in Huelva, Spain. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's Huelva, Huelva, Spain. This is a colossal sculpture. It's 120 feet high. Now, a very coveted commission was the Women's Titanic Memorial, which honors the men who died so that women and children could live. This may be her most famous work. Now, any of you who've seen the movie Titanic, remember the famous scene of Kate Winslet spreading her arms out, right? At the front of the boat, at the front of the Titanic? Well, obviously she was inspired by this sculpture. Here is a view from the front with the inscription that you can see. You might be able to even read it. Gertrude possessed a keen sense that to whom much is given, much is expected. She lived by that credo. So she developed her talent to such a degree that she was able to win numerous commissions. Her memorials all possess a deep pathos and also a sense of gratitude. This one stands at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., and a marble replica was purchased by the French government for the Musée du Luxembourg. Well, let us now turn to the American art that she supported and promoted. Gertrude realized early on that in order to accomplish her goals of promoting modern American art and artists while creating art herself, well, she's going to need help. So she hired as her personal secretary, Juliana Force. Now, here's what's interesting. Juliana was not from high society. However, she worked hard to cultivate herself to fit into high society. She developed a near British accent. She educated herself deeply and broadly in matters of art and high culture, and she would even insinuate to others that she was an aristocratic woman, despite her family being forced to move to Hoboken, New Jersey, because her father's hat business had failed. So she had to lie a little bit in order to be welcomed into that society. Juliana started her career with Gertrude as an administrator and manager of affairs, a sort of chief of staff, but she grew to be an advisor in matters of art as well. Well, now let's look at the artists these two women supported. Whitney's and Force's ardent support of living American artists of the time, particularly younger or emerging ones, included George Bellows, Stuart Davis, Charles Demuth, you see their work in that order, and Mabel Dwight, Edward Hopper, Charles Demuth, John Sloan. He's on the far right there. Now, this work by George Bellows, it's not too modern. In fact, it's a rather nice impressionistic work depicting a lovely winter scene along the Hudson River. But by purchasing such early works as these, Gertrude gave Bellows the freedom to develop his subject and style into this. George Bellows was a disciple of Robert Henri, who encouraged Bellows to change his subject matter. This subject, a boxing match, was considered unworthy of fine art at the time. It is characteristic of the Ashcan school, which depicted subject matter primarily of the New York working class. The idea was that the aesthetically rich moment was available not simply in the drawing rooms of the rich, but in the everyday world of the lower and middle class. Now, compare that also with Alfred C. Barnes' belief. They had very similar ideas in this regard. It was a highly democratic and egalitarian form of art, Ashcan school was. Now, most of us are familiar with this artist. Again, we have a subject matter highly unusual for artists of the day. Hopper has captured a literal image of a row of shops on 7th Avenue in New York City. Now, at first, Hopper's images don't seem that interesting or remarkable. In fact, rather mundane for their subject matter and their simple, clean rendering. And yet, the more you look at one of his artworks, the more they draw you in. They are almost like an early Ernest Hemingway short story where the very simple, lean description of an everyday sort of moment, something inexplicably significant, is expressed. This work by John Sloan depicts the backyard of a Greenwich Village home. The laundry is hanging out to dry on a cold day. A couple of kids are building a snowman. Is such a subject worthy of a fine artist's attention? Well, to the artist Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was supporting and promoting, yes, it certainly was. John Sloan described well why American artists needed someone like Gertrude. He said, quote, "Artists in a frontier society like ours are like cockroaches in kitchens, not wanted, not encouraged, but nevertheless they remain." Cockroaches in kitchens. Now, even though this is a nature scene, the lines and forms are even more simplified than in Hopper's and Sloan's work. Such paring down to only the essential was a style very typical of American modernism. I mentioned earlier the similarity in style to how these artists were painting and how Ernest Hemingway, on his way over to Paris, would develop his writing style in the 20s. Hemingway claimed he learned his lean prose by looking at the paintings he saw in Paris. But I think, having come from Chicago and being exposed to some of the American artistic spirit there, he brought with him to Paris a uniquely American predilection to simplicity of form and description. This is a wonderful work, Baptism in Kansas by John Stuart Curry. Gertrude and Juliana were caught up in the democratic egalitarian spirit of American artists at the time. They focused on American art that was turning an ordinary quintessential American scene like this one into fine art, collectible art, the common street scene, the common man and woman, the common event, such as a baptism, were all seen by Whitney's artists as expressions of something decidedly uncommon. Now, this work came to my attention through a wonderful presentation by Whitney Museum educator Lauren Ridloff, who gave the presentation silently through sign language. There is a personal reason Ridloff is drawn to this work by Thomas Hart Benton titled, "The Lord is My Shepherd." First, Thomas Hart Benton loved to celebrate the hardworking American. Look at the hands of both of these figures, gnarled from labor, yet still strong and capable. But now look at the woman's eyes. They are fixed on the mouth of the man. Both are silent. That is because they are deaf. You see the quote on the plaque behind the man's head, "The Lord is my shepherd"? Well, the man's head blocks out some of the last words so that all we see is, "The Lord is heard." Perhaps this is Benton's attempt to clue us into the reality of this couple. And of course, she championed abstract and surrealist works as well. And she did purchase works by well-established artists, not simply up-and-coming artists. After all, she could easily afford it. Marsden Hartley was already well known when Gertrude purchased this abstract work, as was Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, Russian immigrant Max Weber had been to Paris in the early days of Cubism and brought the style back to America, where he was mercilessly ridiculed and brutalized by the art critics in the media. Weber went through a period of deep struggle, and it was the generosity of patrons like Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney that kept him going. Now, another disciple of Robert Henri was Stuart Davis. He's best known for colorful, jazzy works that he created in the 40s and 50s. And yet he began as an ashcan artist before becoming a cubist. This abstract work from 1927 is titled Egg Beater Number 1. And you can see how he has fused the two styles, Cubism and ashcan. You see, he's got a common everyday item in urban households, an egg beater, as the subject, but completely sliced and diced and rearranged it in a cubist style. Instead of a still life, we feel nothing but vital activity in this work. Davis described his modern art as a reflection of the positive progressive fact of modern industrial technology. So many of the romantic artists of the time, which the public loved, were critical of technology. So they painted beautiful images of the landscape. Modern artists were engaging in the present reality of technology, trying to come to terms with it in their art. And the public wasn't ready for it. So a work like this was ridiculed. In 1929, Gertrude offered her fabulous collection. At the time, it was around 500 or so modern American artworks, offered it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And she even offered to fund the building of a wing on the museum to house it. They said, no thanks. To give you an idea as to why the Met refused, here's something I dug up in my research. A trustee of the Met once asked the museum's president, quote, "What do you mean by American art? There is nothing American worth notice." That's right, the Met didn't believe American art was worthy of its galleries. So in 1931, with the help of Juliana Force, the Whitney Museum of American Art opened in the studio and gallery space Gertrude had previously made available to artists. And Juliana was named the first director of the Whitney Museum in 1931. It started out humbly in these studio spaces. But in the 1960s, they moved into this modernist building designed by Marcel Breuer, a Hungarian architect. Hungarian. It may have been the most disliked building in New York when it was completed. It was called the Madison Avenue Monster. Well, in 2015, the Whitney moved into this striking building designed by an Italian architect, Renzo Piano. Now, I don't know why a museum dedicated to promoting American art would choose a Hungarian architect and then later an Italian architect to design their buildings. But here is what I do know. The Whitney not only continues to exhibit the best of early American modern art and regularly has retrospectives of established American artists, but also, as it did from the very beginning, exhibits the work of younger, as yet unknown artists. In its mission statement, the Whitney Museum states, quote, "As the preeminent advocate for American art, we foster the work of living artists at critical moments in their careers. The Whitney educates a diverse public through direct interaction with artists, often before their work has achieved general acceptance." Let me repeat that last phrase, before their work has achieved general acceptance. Now, what kind of a museum does that? That last part is critical. When most museums only exhibit the well-established stars of the art world, the Whitney carries on its founder's belief that the best way to help an artist is to, one, support them when they are still unknown and struggling, and two, engage with and educate the public so that we can not only recognize that talent, but have our lives enriched by that talent. So if any of us want to engage more with art, to expand our appreciation and taste for art, why not take our cues from Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and start locally in our own area? Perhaps we may discover our own diamond in the rough and play a small yet important role in their development into an exceptional artist.